Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Role models play an important part in all of our lives, whether we seek them out or not. And whether we walk the Buddhist path or not, they can have the power to shape the direction we take and the ability to influence the decisions that flow on from there. Life, with its ebbs and flows, challenges and opportunities, and at every turn we often seek wise counsel, examples that we can follow, and emulate people that we can respect or look up to, and much, much more. On the Buddhist path, the Buddha, for all intents and purposes, is our most eminent role model, teacher, and the Perfectly Enlightened One. There are also many noble and great disciples of the Buddha, those who have ordained as well as lay people, who were commended and praised by the Buddha for different qualities and or aspects of their practice. This will be a recurring segment on the podcast, where we ask who are our role models, and feature some of these great disciples of the Buddha. The aim is to learn about these noble beings and delight in their lives and accomplishments, learn from them, highlight the importance of recognizing them as noteworthy role models, and as inspiration towards the Noble Eightfold Path. Today we'll be focusing on one of the noble male lay disciples of the Buddha, and that's Hatthaka of Alavi, or also known as Hatthaka of Āḷavī. He was born the son of the ruler or king of Āḷavī, and he was a prominent male lay disciple of the Buddha, very similar to Citta, the householder. In respect of Hatthaka, he had a very large following, so he was one of the noble male disciples who gathered a large following. So that was one of the things that he was renowned for. He was praised by the Buddha for a number of very good qualities, but he was also the foremost of the male lay disciples amongst those who gather a following by means of the four bases of kindliness or sympathy. So in Pali that is catūhi, saṅgahavatthūhi, parisaṁ, saṅgaṇhantānaṁ. So we're going to look at his qualities in more detail. One of the main things is that he passed away having attained path and fruit of a non-returner, so also similar to Citta the householder and a number of other lay disciples of the Buddha. So very interesting and helpful to us in the development of our path. We can now look at what the Buddha means by these four bases of kindliness. And there's this sutta called the Saṅgaha Sutta, and it's in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 4, discourse number 32. And the Buddha says in this sutta, bhikkhus, there are these four bases of kindliness. What for? Giving, kind speech, taking care of others, and treating equally. These are the four bases of kindliness. Giving, kind speech, taking care of others, and treating equally under diverse worldly conditions as is suitable to fit each case. These bases of kindliness are like the linchpin of a rolling chariot. If there were no such basis of kindliness, neither mother nor father would be able to obtain esteem and veneration from their children. But since there exist these bases of kindliness, wise people respect them. Thus they attain to greatness and are highly praised. So there's a number of things that we can look at here to understand this a little bit better, but let's just quickly draw out a few things that are interesting. So these four bases of kindliness, they're according to what is suitable to fit each case. So not one size fits all when it comes to applying these four bases of kindliness. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the Buddha says these bases of kindliness are the linchpin of a rolling chariot. So if they're not there, that means you can't really roll the chariot. It either falls apart or it just won't move. So that's another thing. And then when it comes to the simile that the Buddha kind of uses, he gives the example of mother and father. So these are qualities that the mother and father would have in order to bring up their children and receive esteem and veneration from children for having these qualities. So it's very interesting for us to look at it in this way, like have that as the juxtaposition for understanding these qualities. Because even wise people respect mother and father for these qualities. Also they attain to greatness and are highly praised. So again, when it comes to people, just generally, not even simply mother and father, but any kind of role, like even leadership role or role where you have prominence in your community, it's because these qualities are there, and therefore people follow you, listen to you, or are willing to listen to you, and are willing to receive guidance from you. It's a very important teaching on many levels. So let's look at some translation and application. So in terms of saṅgaha, which is the name of this sutta, saṅgaha, when you look into the translation of this word, you get sympathy, you get inclusion, friendliness, kind disposition, help, offering support, assistance, treatment, protection, and favor. So the general idea you get from these words of English from the Pali is that it's some kind of kindness, some kind of sympathy, some kind of support, and good treatment, really. Then when you look at another way of looking at saṅgahavatthūhi, that these four bases, they're the means by which you can attract people towards you, a means of sustaining the relationship. And what characterizes the whole thing is really, what underpins it is really friendship, generosity, and respect. That's probably what's fundamentally behind these four bases of kindliness. So if we look at each one, the first one is giving. So the Pali is dana, which we've covered before. So this also includes charity and generosity, those sorts of things. The second one is endearing or kind speech. So this is peya vaja. So that's quite straightforward. The third one is taking care of others. So in Pali, this is attacārya. So this also is good conduct, like doing good, having beneficent conduct. Being busy for the welfare of others, taking care of others. So that one is very much you go out of your way to make sure another person is all right. You look out for their well-being. And then the last one is treating equally. So the Pali is samanatatta. So sometimes this is translated as impartiality, equality, sociability. But I think the easiest way of thinking about it is really treating equally, treating identically. So no matter what walk of life you come from, rich or poor, good background or bad background, or in between, you treat that person equally. So when you look at it, the four bases of kindliness is you're not stingy, you're prepared to give. The words that come out of your mouth are always with kindness or compassion. You look out for the welfare of others, that's why you take care of them. And then when you treat people who are around you, you treat them equally. There's no preferences, or I guess it's very much a metta quality. So there's very much metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha type leanings when you look at these four bases of kindliness. So there's the loving kindness, the compassion, the joy, and also the equanimity. So those are the things that are fostered within this kind of behavior. So very, very wonderful that there are people at the time of the Buddha that would have that. You can see why people would gather around such a person is because the person won't turn you away. Instead, they would draw you closer in terms of doing what it takes to help you and doing what it takes to have your well-being counted in this kind of association or company, and not feeling judged, not feeling oppressed or anything like that. So that makes a lot of sense. In Dhamma communities, you also see the same thing. The people that tend to be quite popular, even amongst lay people, is people that are quite generous, people who don't have harsh speech and divisive speech and all those sorts of things, more like kind speech, speak from a place of loving kindness. And then when it comes to taking care of others, particularly those that go out of their way to call, to offer assistance, to stand up when someone is in trouble, to share the Dhamma when someone wants to know something or has a question, and also doesn't have any preferences, no kind of preferences around this or that, in the sense of macharya, or the stinginess around kulas, different groups, you treat equally. So it's very much metta within a lot of this. When you go to the Ayacana Vagga or even the Ayacana Sutta, the Buddha says, bhikkhus, a male lay follower endowed with conviction, so saddha, rightly aspiring, should aspire thus. May I be like Citta the householder and Hatthaka of Āḷavī. These are the standard and measure for my male lay followers, and that is the householder Citta and Hatthaka of Āḷavī. So he's held in very high esteem, as with Citta the householder. And when you go to Gautama Buddhavansa, again, it's also repeated, the foremost male lay patrons of Gautama Buddha, Citta and Hatthaka of Āḷavī. The Buddha's advice to his female lay followers who are mothers is also very similar. He begins by saying, dreadful are gain, honour and praise. A faithful female lay follower rightly imploring her only son, dear and beloved, might implore him thus, dear, you should become like Citta the householder and Hatthaka of Āḷavī, for this is the standard and criterion for my male lay disciples who are lay followers, that is, Citta the householder and Hatthaka of Āḻavī. But if, dear, you go forth from household life into homelessness, you should become like Sariputta and Moggallana, for this is the standard and criterion for my male disciples who are bhikkhus, that is Sariputta and Moggallana. While, dear, you are a trainee, one who has not yet reached his mind's ideal, may gain, honour and praise not come upon you. Because if gain, honour and praise come upon a bhikkhu while he is a trainee, one who has not yet reached his mind's ideal, this is an obstacle for him, so dreadful bhikkhus are gain, honour and praise. Thus should you train yourselves. So we've seen a similar sutta when it comes to daughters and the role models that the Buddha gives for female lay disciples is Kujuttara Upasika and Balukantaki, both of which we've looked at before. So you can see that the Buddha is very, very clear about who the role models are, but also he's very explicit about gain, honour and praise. So this is Labha Sakara Silokam. And this is applicable both to lay people but also to monastics, that gain, honour and praise, they actually foster, breed defilements, because one can become quite intoxicated and imbued with these things and therefore almost like diverge or abandon the path as a result of it. So if you're a male lay follower, essentially you would become intoxicated and maybe veer off, maybe start to raise those higher than Buddha's teachings and therefore abandon the path. Likewise, if you were monastic, you could get imbued in those things and maybe also delay the path, if not disrobe and go towards samsara more so than nibbana. So very interesting how Buddha frames these things. But essentially, what we get out of it is if you have a son, then as a mother you give your son the role model of Citta the householder and Hatthaka of Āḷavī if they are male lay disciples of the Buddha. The account of how Hatthaka of Alavi meets the Buddha is in Anguttara Nikāya. It's in chapter 3, discourse number 35. And Hatthaka is actually out walking and exercising, and he comes across the Buddha, who is sitting on a pile of leaves on a cow track in one of the groves in Āḷavī. And so Hatthaka approaches the Buddha and politely asks him that if he slept well. And this is very similar to how Anathapindika questions the Buddha when he also meets the Buddha for the first time. What's interesting is always how the Buddha answers. It's cryptic but with something of a teaching within it. So in the case of Hatthaka, he actually answers that he sleeps well, and he's one of the people in the world that sleeps well. And the prince can't really understand how that is so, because at the time that he meets the Buddha, he actually says the winter nights are cold. It is the 8-day interval, the time when snow falls. The ground is trampled by the hooves of cattle, so it's rough. The leaves are spread very thin because the leaves on the tree are sparse. And the robes that the Buddha's wearing would leave one cold because the wind is blowing so cold. And so he questions the Buddha, how is it possible that you sleep well under these conditions? And so the Buddha gives a series of questions and then answers, and asks Hatthaka a number of these questions and also asks him to answer quite truthfully. So he describes the householder's abode, which is very much It has the roof that is well insulated. Inside, everything is shut tight so that the wind doesn't come in. There's lavish furnishings and there is a fire, and of course the person has wives. So he asked Hatthaka, would that person sleep well under these conditions? And of course the prince would say that one does. And then the Buddha goes on to talk about if that particular householder or householder's son, that if they would have lust, hatred or delusion, would they sleep well? Or would they be tormented in their sleep and sleep quite badly? And of course, Hatthaka answers that if they had mental fevers, mental or bodily fevers that were born of lust, hatred or delusion, then yes, they would be troubled in their sleep. They would be tormented and sleep quite badly. And the Buddha goes on to say that he himself has abandoned lust, hatred and delusion, cut it off at the root, made it like a palm stump, obliterated it so it's subject to no future arising. Therefore, he sleeps really well. And then he ends by saying to Hatthaka, he always sleeps well. The Brahmin who has attained Nibbana, cooled off without acquisitions, not tainted by sensual pleasures, having cut off all attachments, having removed anguish in the heart, the peaceful one sleeps well, having attained peace of mind. So it's very interesting that Buddha, whenever he meets someone such as Hatthaka of Alavi or Anathapindika, there's always a teaching about greed, hatred and delusion, and to know the distinction between the Buddha and those that practice like the Buddha versus those that are still caught up in the world. And so of course, the people who are ready, such as Hatthaka or Anathapindika or Citta, the householder, they quickly find conviction towards the Buddha's teaching, and they lean towards it and take refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and then from there they start to develop the path. We have two accounts in the suttas where the Buddha actually says to the monks how one should remember Hatthaka as possessing 8 particular qualities. What's interesting about these two accounts is they offer slightly different things. So the first account is interesting to us because the Buddha starts off by giving 7 good qualities, but then later he adds on an 8th, and there's a good reason for that. And then in the second account, he just simply expresses 8 of those qualities after Hatthaka visits the Buddha accompanied by 500 people in his congregation. And the Buddha questions Hatthaka about how he maintains such a large congregation of followers. And Hatthaka, of course, answers in accordance with these 4 bases of kindliness. So in the first account, what's interesting is the Buddha actually says that Hatthaka possesses the 7 qualities. So the first one is conviction, which is saddha. The second is virtue, or virtuous behavior, which is sīlava. The third is the sense of moral shame, which is hirima. The fourth is the fear of wrongdoing, which is ottappa. And then he says that Hatthaka is learned, which is bahusata. He's also generous, so chāgava. And he's also wise, paññava. So when the Buddha says this, what happens is he retires for the evening, and then the next day, one of the bhikkhus who was in that audience, he visits Hatthaka of Alavi for almsgiving. And after sitting down, he says to Hatthaka, he recounts what the Buddha said about him, these 7 good qualities. And interestingly, Hatthaka asks him, was there any white-robed male lay disciples in the audience when the Buddha said this? And then the monk says, no, there weren't, it was only monks. And then Hatthaka says, good. And then after that offers alms food, and then the monk returns to the monastery. So the monk, after returning to the monastery, he goes to report to the Buddha and says, this is what Hatthaka said and all that sort of thing. And then the Buddha says, very interestingly, he says, good, bhikkhu. That clansman has few desires, since he does not want his inner wholesome qualities to be known by others. Therefore, bhikkhu, you should remember Hatthaka of Alavi as one who possesses this 8th wonderful and marvelous quality, and that is fewness of desires, which is apicco. So what's interesting about that account is that these qualities very much are in line with the Sekha Paripada Sutta, so the Sekha's mode of progress. So you have 6 of them which are in line with that. So that's the saddha, which is the conviction, silava, which is the virtuous behavior, hiri, and ottappa, which is the shame and fear of wrongdoing, bahusutta, which is being learned in both the words of the Buddha and the practice of the Buddha's teachings, and then panyava, which is wisdom, being wise. So the two additional ones are chāgava, which is really around generosity, and with generosity that means you're giving up stinginess. And then the eighth one that he adds on at the end is apicco. When you look at this last one, it means really desiring little, having few desires, few wishes, which also can also translate as easily satisfied, easily contented. So this is very much, you remember from the karaniya metta, this is also one of the qualities that the Buddha talks about, that you're easily satisfied, not difficult to maintain type quality, even when you visit another person's house or you stay over at another person's house. So fewness of wishes. So it's a very complete set that the Buddha has given in terms of how one should remember Hatthaka. And interestingly, he has the trainee's mode of progress within those qualities. We know from the suttas that Hatthaka of Alavi was declared a non-returner, so he realized path and fruit of non-return, so anagami. So that's someone who's ended the 5 lower fetters, is reborn spontaneously into Suddhavasa, or the pure abodes, and from there they would realize nibbana, so they're not liable to return to any of the other worlds. So the 5 lower fetters are sakkaya ditthi, so identity view. You also abandon vichikicha, the doubt, silabbata paramasa, which is misapprehension of virtue and observances. You also abandon kama raga, which is lust for sensual pleasures. And the last one is patigha, which is aversion, you also abandon. Just like Hatthaka, there was also other lay disciples, some of whom we've been through before. Citta the householder, Velukantaki, Queen Samavati, they're all non-returners. There's also Uga of Vesali, Uga of Hathigamma, and then in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha spoke over a number of names who were also the lay people who had realized non-return, and over 50 men in a particular town. Now, when he was asked in one of the middle-length discourses about how many were non-returners in terms of anagami, and I think it was Vajja who asked this question, the Buddha said they're not just 100 celibate laymen or laywomen, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 500, but many, many more than that. So we don't know the exact number, but at the time of the Buddha, there would have been quite a few non-returners, as also once returners, and also ones that had entered the stream. So that's encouragement for us to actually practice with these as the standard and measure, as the role models for our practice in terms of realizing path and fruit, and definitely towards leaning towards nibbana and looking at all the wonderful qualities that these noble lay disciples had actually cultivated and developed as part of path and practice. The final sutta that we can look at is about a deva from the pure abodes who visits the Buddha, and it's in Anguttara Nikāya, chapter 3, discourse number 127, and this is associated with Hatthaka of Āḷavī. So it says, on one occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove under the Pindika's park. Then when the night had advanced, the young deva, Hatthaka, illuminating the entire Jeta's Grove, approached the Blessed One. Having approached, while thinking, I will stand in front of the Blessed One, he sank down, descended, and could not remain in place. Just as ghee or oil, when poured on sand, sinks down and descends and does not remain in place, so the young deva, Hatthaka, sank down, descended, and could not remain in place. Then the Blessed One said to Hatthaka, create a gross body, Hatthaka. Yes, Bhante, Hatthaka replied. Then he created a gross body, paid homage to the Blessed One, and stood to one side. The Blessed One then said to him, Hatthaka, do those teachings that you could recall in the past when you were a human being come back to you now? And then Hatthaka replies, Bhante, those teachings that I could recall in the past when I was a human being come back to me now. And those teachings that I could not recall in the past when I was a human being come back to me now. Just as the Blessed One is now hemmed in by bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, male and female lay followers, kings and royal ministers, sectarian teachers and their disciples, so I am hemmed in by other young devas, young devas come to me even from a distance, thinking, we will hear the Dhamma from the young deva Hatthaka. I died, Bhante, insatiable and unquenchable in 3 things. What 3? I died insatiable and unquenchable in seeing the Blessed One. I died insatiable and unquenchable in hearing the good Dhamma. I died insatiable and unquenchable in attending upon the Sangha. I died insatiable and unquenchable in these 3 things. I could not get enough of seeing the Blessed One, hearing the good Dhamma and attending on the Sangha. Training in the higher virtuous behavior, I rejoiced in hearing the good Dhamma. Hatthaka has gone to rebirth in Avihā, not having gotten enough of these 3 things. So this is a very informative and very marvelous sutta that we're actually given here. So there's a number of things we can go through. So the first thing is Hatthaka is reborn in Avihā. So Avihā is often translated as the first of the pure abodes where one doesn't fall away. And what's interesting about this is firstly that Hatthaka has returned to see the Buddha, and he creates a gross body in order for him to be around the Buddha and to have a conversation. Interestingly, the Buddha could actually sense or see the young deva, so he kindly asked him to create a gross body so he wouldn't sink down. Secondly, the question that the Buddha asks Hatthaka is whether he recalls the teachings from the past. And what's really interesting about his response is that he recalls those that he remembered, and he also recalls the one when he was a human being that he had not remembered. So for us, the way we can understand that is when we remember or we don't remember particular verses of the Buddha, particular steps of the meditation, having been reborn into the pure abodes, he remembers all of those things, whatever he had heard from the Buddha, particularly as a human being. So that's very wonderful to know, because sometimes in this human body, memory becomes such a huge issue. Like in order to do certain meditations, in order to recollect the Buddha's teachings, the good Dhamma, our memory fails us as we get older. And so when we keep training to remember. But this is kind of very helpful to know that if you're reborn into, in this case, pure abodes, you can remember those things. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is that he is teaching in the pure abodes. Young devas come to him even from a distance to hear the Dhamma from Hatthaka. And as we know, Hatthaka is one of very little conceit, even when he was a human being. And so when he speaks to the Buddha in this way, he's not boasting or anything. He's just almost like informing. So if one has an aspiration to teach, then it seems like it is possible in the pure abodes. Not only that, if you think about all these non-returners we have spoken about, Citta the householder, Queen Samavati, Velukantaki, people like that, because of the duration in the pure abodes, they're upwards of 1,000 mahakappas, depending all the way up to Akanita, it's even higher than that. Then it's only been just under 2,600 years after the Buddha. So these so-called noble lay disciples who have ascended to the pure abodes, they would still be around and they would be teaching. So that is most interesting that could be the case. Now, the final thing that is most interesting about what Hatthaka says is he reveals that he could not get enough of seeing the Buddha, that he still wanted to hear the good Dhamma and he wanted to attend to the Sangha. So with this thing that he's still clinging on to, he came to exist again. So this time, because of his path and fruit, he came to exist in the pure abodes. So that's very telling for us, that if one aspires to Nibbana, to complete extinguishment, to complete liberation, one has to let go of Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So that is a huge revelation in that respect. But clearly in the pure abodes, it's possible to listen to Dhamma. It's possible to practice. It's possible to be around noble disciples of the Buddha, noble beings who have developed path and practice. So these are a few things that are very interesting from this final sutta. But overall, Hatthaka's example provides us with a good standard and measure for us to develop our own path and to develop qualities, sekha qualities as well as samana qualities that enable us to realize path and fruit, enable us to lean towards Nibbana, if not realize full extinguishment. We can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you well. Teruan Saranai.